Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. We are at DLD in Munich. One of my most trusted tech analysts, writers, journalists is John Thornhill. He is the innovations editor at the Financial Times and the founder of Sifted. He knows his tech as well as anyone, and what he does, I think, is take rather unfashionable views. John, the big news at DLD this year has been about this endless decline of Europe and its inability to compete technologically with China and the United States. But it seems as if you have a slightly different take on Europe's supposed technological decline.
Yeah, I think there's a very binary debate at the moment that tech is only about US and China and Europe isn't also ran. But I think a lot of things have happened in Europe over the past 10, 15 years that really make it quite an interesting place for tech at the moment. Firstly, we've seen the development of a really vibrant early stage ecosystem right across Europe. Unlike Silicon Valley, it's a very diffuse ecosystem from kind of Stockholm in the north. You've got Warsaw now emerging as a very interesting tech place. We're in Munich, which has got a very strong technological tradition. We've got Paris emerging as a big AI center and for quantum as well. And London, of course, which is the kind of VC capital of Europe and has a lot of interesting AI and other fintech startups as well. So I think part of the problem with Europe, in a way, is that it's a very diffuse ecosystem. It's not concentrated, and therefore it appears weaker than it is. No question, Europe is not punching at the same level as Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, a lot of startups being founded, and a lot of money going into the sector. The last numbers I looked at was that the US has kind of pulled ahead again in terms of VC funding, accounting for about 70% of the global total. But Europe has about 14% of the global VC funding. And it is, I think, creating some interesting companies that even American VC companies are now getting increasingly interested in and wanting to invest in.
Why then, John, are people writing Europe off? Is it just lazy thinking, convenient, or somehow gels with the pessimistic zeitgeist in Europe at the moment?
Well, I think when you look at some of the numbers, they tend to be backward looking. So a lot of people cite the fact that Europe has not created any kind of massive tech companies over the past 10, 15 years. And so I think that you just look at the straight numbers between the Magnificent Seven and the market capitalization of these companies and European companies, and there is a vast gulf between them. But that is somewhat of a kind of backward-looking indicator, and I think there are companies emerging in Europe that are going to become globally relevant, and in certain areas I think Europe does have a chance of kind of creating something of real value and global resonance.
What about the politics and the culture of this? Some people think that Europe brings perhaps a degree of responsibility, particularly towards AI. Can Europe uniquely contribute, for example, to the regulatory side of AI without killing the egg that the golden goose, or the golden egg that the goose lays?
Well, I think from a European perspective, they would like to think that regulation helps lead to a more trusted technological environment, and people will therefore be happier to entrust their data with companies, and that will lead to a more trusted ecosystem. I think, in truth, that is working better in theory than it is in practice, and that people are quite happy to use Google Search or Facebook or X at the moment, or TikTok, and they don't worry overly about how their data is being used. So I think that the more onerous regulations in Europe are undoubtedly kind of constraint on the speed at which local companies can innovate. And as we see around the world, regulation can often help defend the incumbents rather than aid the insurgents. So I think there is a genuine issue with over-regulation in Europe, and the Commission has recognised it such itself and is now coming up with a digital omnibus and trying to kind of pare down a lot of the regulations and simplify things. But that said, I think there are areas, healthcare, education, transport, energy, which are very heavily regulated sectors. Even in the US, you've got a lot of regulations that are affecting all these sectors. And I think if there can be more of a constructive dialogue between the tech companies and the regulators to create a more trusted environment, that does create some possibilities in Europe. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's a possibility it will happen, rather than, I think, the more antagonistic mood in America, where it does seem to be very much a case of the kind of tech companies against all forms of regulation. And you're seeing the fragmentation itself in America, with so many states now looking to regulate AI in particular, even if Washington isn't doing that.
And I know you've often argued that America is a little more complex than some of its critics or indeed admirers present. I mean, after all, in the United States, there are guys like Steve Case, who was the CEO of AOL in the glory years of the 1990s, who is taking a more nuanced position when it comes to regulation and technology.
Sure, and I think he was arguing the kind of third wave of tech is going to hit the real economy and all of the sectors which I just mentioned, which are heavily regulated. So there has to be more of a dialogue between the tech companies and governments and policymakers in particular. You can't just release a software product and expect everyone to use it without any regard to the circumstances or the context in which it's used. So I think that's true. And I think the single market in Europe has created, in theory, a market of 450 million people. And if you can harmonise regulations across that area, and particularly if you can include Britain, which, sad to say, kind of exited from the EU, but is still aligned in many respects with EU regulation, you've got a market of over 500 million people, and that does create an interesting pool of customers. So, for example, in areas like autonomous driving or drone technology, there are still issues in the US, as I understand, between going from one state to another, and different states having different regulations. If there can truly be kind of harmonized regulation across Europe, which there is beginning to develop in some of these areas, that would be a massive advantage to Europe.
So what's the story in the UK? You're based in London, John. As I said, one of the reasons I love your work is you're always very nuanced. You don't fall into the absurdist camp of either suggesting that Britain is the new Singapore or the new catastrophe state. What's really happening on the tech front in London?
Well, I think Europe and London in particular have a very good story to tell about tech, which, rather strangely to my mind, the government is not really shouting about as loudly as it could do. I think that the UK is the third biggest kind of tech ecosystem in the world, although it's a very long way behind the US and China. But there is a real kind of buzz about London at the moment. We have world-class universities in London and in Oxford and Cambridge and Edinburgh, Sheffield and so on. Interesting kind of tech developing out of all of these places. We've got a big AI community in London. London is a big global city, and therefore it's kind of hardwired into finance and industry as well, in a way that's not necessarily true in Silicon Valley. So I think there are a lot of possibilities in London. There's a lot of momentum happening. I think Brexit undoubtedly, I think, set this back a long way. But companies are developing. A lot of AI companies in particular are developing fast, and I think it will become an increasingly interesting place as the US VC funds themselves have discovered. They've set up shop in London and are now kind of actively scouring the UK and the rest of Europe for interesting investments.
What is the moral of the story of DeepMind? On the one hand, of course, it reflects British innovation at its best. Demis Hassabis is now very senior. He runs AI at Google. He sold his company, I think it was in 2014 or 2015, to Google for, seemed at the time, a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. Now it seems like a remarkable bargain. Does it suggest the vitality of the British tech sector, or does it give the other story that whenever a British entrepreneur is successful, eventually they sell out to a US company and either move the operation or themselves to Silicon Valley?
I think it's the latter story, that I think that DeepMind got to a stage where it realized that if it wanted to remain at the kind of frontier of AI, it needed massive amounts of capital, it needed massive amounts of compute power and massive amounts of data, and Google was able to provide that. I think it's easy to look back now and say, well, given how important DeepMind is in the kind of AI universe, that it was a terrible mistake to have sold to Google, but clearly Google DeepMind would not be what it is today if it hadn't sold itself to Google. And I think there's no question that it would have developed a lot slower had it remained independent and struggled to find funding in Europe. And I think that's the big deformation, or the fault or the flaw of the European tech ecosystem at the moment. It's very good at creating vibrant startups at the moment, but it's failing pretty badly when it comes to scaling these and turning them into globally relevant companies. And I think there is a real problem with kind of growth capital in Europe, that you cannot take a kind of mid-sized tech company in Europe and really scale it in the way that is second nature in Silicon Valley.
And of course it's second nature in Silicon Valley because of the venture community ecosystem. Can the state, and the EU in particular, can it offer an alternative manner of financing startups in Europe?
I mean, certainly there have been big attempts for the governments to do that. The European Investment Bank invests very heavily, or a European Investment Fund invests very heavily, supporting the VC sector. In Britain, we have the British Business Bank. In France, BPI France are very active early stage investors, and they're trying to crowd in the private markets and also are investing directly in VC funds themselves. But I think the real game changer would be if the pension funds were to invest in the way that a lot of institutional funds and endowments invest in the US in alternative assets. Europe has a lot of money. There's something like 9.6 trillion euros of pension fund assets in Europe. Only about 0.01% of that goes into VC. Comparable figures, I think, in the US or North America are about 0.5%. So if Europe could get anywhere near the North American levels of VC investment from institutional funds, that would be truly transformational in Europe. There have been a lot of attempts, a lot of rhetoric and a lot of moral suasion to try to force people to do this, and it's still moving, I think, more slowly than people would like. There's a talk about whether governments ought to mandate greater institutional investment in the VC sector and growth capital more broadly. I think that debate is going to develop because I think it's a strategic imperative for Europe to do this.
Are there also the cultural problems of failure? In America, of course, people seem to boast of their failure, particularly if they've been successful after failing. Whereas in Europe, the idea of failure still is regarded shamefully, particularly on the financial front. I know in Germany that's a huge problem. Does this still need to change, John?
It does to some extent. I think that's true probably broadly across society, but I think the sector that we're talking about, that's not the case anymore. I think certainly in the kind of startup world and VC world, people absolutely acknowledge the fact that you're going to launch a business, it stands a pretty thin chance of succeeding. And so I think people are becoming more accustomed to failure and learning from failure and then trying again and failing better, hopefully succeeding. So I think that kind of culture of Silicon Valley actually has become quite strongly infused in a lot of the tech centers around Europe. I think it's more a question of kind of scale of ambition. You're still seeing a lot of European tech companies selling out to American companies partly because of the difficulty of raising the growth capital that they need to take them to another level, and partly it's a perfectly rational decision given that the resources of a lot of tech companies that you have, that it makes sense to sell yourself to an American company who can turn you more rapidly than you otherwise could into kind of a globally relevant player. So we've seen a slew of AI companies in Europe, Sana Labs, Silo, Faculty, and so on, selling themselves recently to American companies. And sadly, I think we're going to see more of that before we've mobilized enough growth capital to enable companies like that really to become very significant global companies.
I mentioned Hassabis at Google. He is head of AI. He's perhaps the most powerful figure in the company. I know that some people think that he will be the next CEO of Google. DeepMind still has a large office in London, and I don't think Demis comes to the Valley very often. Can one even talk about a company like Google as being an American company? Aren't all these tech leviathans global companies now?
They clearly operate on a global basis, and a lot of them have make more of their business outside America than they do within it now. But I think certainly in spirit and focus, they are very much American companies. And I think that's particularly true in the Trump administration, where Trump is clearly making themselves self-identify as American companies. So I think there was a sense back in the day that they saw themselves as global companies. They didn't want necessarily to be wholly identified as American, but certainly within America now, it's very useful to fly the flag and play that patriotic card.
How is Trump's state capitalism being treated intellectually in Europe by investors, by entrepreneurs?
With great puzzlement, I think. I think Europeans are not averse to industrial policy, even though the Chinese are probably practicing it in a lot better way than Europe is at the moment. But whether what Trump is doing qualifies as a kind of thought through and coherent industrial strategy, I think a lot of people in Europe would question. It appears to be more to be kind of interventionist in particular sectors. I'm not quite sure there's a kind of guiding philosophy or coherence behind a lot of what appears to be taking place in America. It is very much kind of asserting what Trump sees as America's national interests, which are not necessarily the same as America's national interests.
Is there a European third way, John? I know you're a big fan of Dan Wang's book on China, in which he talked about China being run by engineers and the United States by lawyers. Can Europe, and perhaps we might include the United Kingdom in that, can they develop a third way, a third alternative beyond lawyers and engineers?
Well, I think Dan Wang would definitely argue not, that he's pretty dismissive of what's going on in Europe and thinks that it really is about the US and China. I disagree with him on that. I think there is a possibility that Europe could emerge more strongly in tech if it could just mobilize a lot of the assets that it has. And so, yes, I think it is possible to have a third way in tech. In particular, I think we're seeing at the moment a kind of fusion of hardware and software. And in kind of Dan Wang's view that America is the kind of software superpower, China is the hardware superpower. China is getting software very, very quickly, and I think it is definitely kind of fusing hardware and software. America clearly is trying to do the reverse, as it were, starting from software and trying to fuse more with hardware, as we're seeing with the massive developments of data centers, and we're seeing in robotics in particular. And Europe can play in that world. I think it's there is an interesting kind of play to be had about fusing hardware and software and developing companies that really can be kind of ambidextrous in that sense. And so I think in robotics, particularly in industrial robotics, maybe in some areas of kind of autonomous robotics as well, Europe can play.
And are there key sectors in Europe now, John? You travel extensively, your work at Sifted means that you have access to all the most interesting companies. Is there a new Estonia, or perhaps is Estonia leading the charge now? Berlin, London, Lisbon? What are the real hot spots now when it comes to innovation in Europe? What are the stories that we don't know?
I think, Munich itself, where we are at the moment, is a really interesting kind of tech center. Quite a lot of unicorns have come out of Munich. They're called Municorns here. I think London is going to remain a very vibrant place for tech. Paris made a very good play, I think, under Macron to be kind of an AI center. I think given that Macron's presidency is now very heavily tarnished, that's kind of sapped some of the momentum that France has had. The Nordics, I think, are racing along at the moment. We're seeing a lot of interesting AI companies emerging from there, most notably kind of Lovable and Legora and so on. Finland as well, interesting kind of quantum companies. I think quantum across Europe is actually developing in a very interesting way. There's been a lot of publicly funded research in quantum in particular. Again, in Germany, we're seeing kind of nuclear fusion technology. It's different from what Commonwealth fusion systems are doing, but in Munich, again, they're two very interesting nuclear fusion companies trying to approach it in very different ways with Marvel Fusion and Proxima Fusion here. And I think certainly the German government appears to want to play big in nuclear fusion, and you will see them kind of stepping in and backing local companies in a big way. So I think there are areas where Europe has still got a lot of research traction, and I think if it can mobilize a lot of growth capital and state support, it could become a very interesting play in some of these areas.
You think that all this innovation in Europe might be one reason why Putin's Russian bear is now so aggressively prowling? I mean, obviously there's Ukraine, more and more threats against the Baltics, even Finland and Scandinavia.
I think, I used to work in Russia for 6 years and was the
you were
Moscow
based
correspondent.
there you were the FT's man in Moscow.
I think the kind of Ukraine war is very much a kind of Russian pathology. They cannot accept that Kiev is the center of a foreign country. Is very much hardwired into the Russian psyche that Kiev is part of the kind of Russian world. So I think there are very particular reasons for that. I'm not sure there's a kind of great broader kind of strategic dimension to all of this. Certainly there's the geostrategic element of kind of NATO expansion, which clearly has rankled very heavily what Russia is doing. But I don't know, I think it's a particular pathology that Russia has in relation to Ukraine. I think there is certainly an impulse that it wants to try to recreate the Soviet empire. But I think it will pause very seriously before kind of taking on a NATO country, unless, of course, NATO now falls apart if America does anything aggressive in Greenland.
Is there any technological innovation in Russia?
For sure. I mean, I think for a very long time, there's a lot of very interesting technology that came out of Russia. Tokamak reactors, we were talking about nuclear fusion. Tokamak was a kind of Russian invention back in the day. There was very interesting early research in AI in Russia. A lot of brilliant Russian scientists and researchers. You know this better than me, but you go to San Francisco and Russian is pretty widely heard in the streets and the kind of tech companies in Silicon Valley. So yes, I think there's some phenomenal raw talent that is still coming out of Russia. Some very interesting companies. Clearly Pavel Durov and the whole kind of Telegram story came out of Russia as well. Vkontakte was a very interesting kind of Facebook imitator. And so yes, I think there is still some tech, but tens of thousands of tech workers fled Russia in 2022 when Russia launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and some of them appear to be going back now, but I think most of them have stayed abroad, mostly in Israel, the Balkans, or if not America.
John, you bring such a well-informed and nuanced take on tech. How do you navigate the endless stream of reports and white papers and research on the impact of AI, particularly when it comes to jobs? It seems every week there's a new report suggesting either the AI will destroy the entire white-collar working class, or that it will create millions of new jobs. And it's hard after a while not to either dismiss these reports or treat them with a degree of skepticism. How should we be dealing with all the data coming out on the future of AI?
I think there are two parallel debates going on at the moment, which don't really intersect very much at all. On the one hand, there's the technological debate about the future of AI. People are saying that AI has the capability to do this, but the capability is not the same as a reality. And so I think it's going to take a lot longer for a lot of AI to be deployed in the real world and for companies to adopt it and to be certain that they can do so safely and securely. So I suspect that the technologists are overestimating the speed at which a lot of this transaction is happening. On the other hand, economists are looking at a lot of what's AI is going on, and I think the consensus view amongst economists is that this is a very interesting general purpose technology. But if you look at the productivity growth line in the US economy since 1870, it's been pretty constant, going up 2% a year through two world wars, a Great Depression, big financial crises every few decades and so on, and the trend line has remained pretty constant. Some of them are now forecasting that might rise by kind of 0.4 percentage points, I think is the central forecast of some of the kind of Fed's institutions in America. That doesn't sound much. That would be a pretty big deal, though, if it was compounded over a decade. But I think these debates at the moment are taking place in parallel. The technologists are not really understanding fully, I think, the context in which new technology gets adopted, and the economists are not fully understanding the scale of the impact that this technology could have.
Two more brief questions, John. I don't want to be too greedy with your time. You're very generous. A lot of skeptics of AI, Gary Marcus comes to mind in particular, argue that generative AI, the LLM revolution, actually ultimately is flawed, and that there'll be new AI technologies that will more profoundly change the world. What's your take on that? Are we still in the early cycle, the early narrative of the story of AI?
I mean, I think Gary Marcus, who you mentioned, is a long-term optimist about AI and thinks that other kind of branches of AI will now come to the fore. I'm sure you speak to a lot more expert people than me on this subject. My sense is that Gary is probably right that the LLM revolution, as it were, has some way to run, but is not going to take us to AGI by itself. And therefore the other branches of AI, which a lot of people are talking about at the moment, are DLD, in particular kind of the world models and your symbolic AI that are developing. If they're fused with the kind of generative AI models, will probably take us a lot further than we are at the moment, and that will kind of lead to the next kind of great wave of innovation in AI. Where that goes, I don't know. I mean, a lot of very interesting, credible voices who argue that the whole concept of AGI is a bit of a myth in itself. People like Blaise Aguero-Yarkas, who wrote this book, What is Intelligence, I think, argues that very persuasively. But his point would be that undoubtedly we're going to develop incredibly powerful, narrow forms of intelligence, and more general forms of intelligence that might not amount to full AGI, however you define it. This is going to have a profound impact on our lives and our economies and our societies, even if we never get to kind of AGI, however defined.
John, let's end with quantum. You wrote recently a very interesting piece on quantum. Obviously 2026 isn't going to be the year of quantum, but might eventually a quantum computing revolution even eclipse AI, make AI perhaps a footnote to quantum computing?
Well, certainly if you talk to a lot of the more enthusiastic quantum companies who are raising money at the moment, yes, they certainly believe that. And I think there's a lot of grounds for believing that this field is developing very fast at the moment. I think that a lot of money is going into it now. People are beginning to see there's real traction. Lots of the different modalities are developing in interesting ways. People are now talking about the quantum advantage being a real thing in a few years' time. I was interviewing people on stage here about that, and I think it's realistic to believe that will happen in the foreseeable future. We will see a kind of fault-tolerant quantum computer developing maybe by the end of the decade, if not before. And that is a game changer. I mean, it will enable us to do things that clearly we can't do just by classical computers alone. So yes, I think I still find it hard to find people who will articulate very precisely exactly how it is going to change, but it does open up a whole new world of possibilities, which is really very exciting.
Well, John Thornhill, when anybody talks about game changers and that man with your care, I think we should take note, so quantum will remain on our radar. I want to thank you so much for the generosity and wisdom that you approach tech in your work at the FT and Sifted, and we'll look forward to having you on the show, certainly this time next year at DLD and hopefully before. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.